In the critically acclaimed novel Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison, the nameless protagonist visits Harlem in order to attempt a civil rights uprising in the area. After viewing a riot ensuing after the population comes together to try to save an elderly couple from being evicted, he tries to use that same momentum to start a civil rights movement with the same energy. However, to his dismay, he discovers that the population does not rally behind him with the same momentum as they did as the elderly couple. Although this novel was written in the early 20th century United States, a similar situation is now occurring in the world today, particularly with the Venezuelan refugee crisis. On February 15, 2018, the World Health Organization reported that an astounding 1/5 of the medical personnel in Venezuela had actually fled the nation, leaving many in Venezuela unable to achieve the basic health care that they need. With Venezuelan citizens now not fleeing the nation in order to seek opportunity elsewhere, it is now imperative to ask the question: Will the Venezuelan refugee crisis be more devastating than the Syrian crisis? The answer to that question is no, because similar to the situation in Invisible Man, there are many distinct underlying reasons separating why people are why there's much more devastation in the Syrian civil crisis than the devastation in the Venezuelan refugee crisis. Those key differences are why the refugees are actually fleeing the country. Next, that there's much more collaboration in the Venezuelan refugee crisis than the Syrian crisis. And lastly, that Venezuela is not sitting on such an important commodity that Syria is sitting on, that commodity being oil. Now, when first talking about the refugee crisis occurring between the two nations, it is important to understand why the refugees are fleeing Venezuela as opposed to why the refugees are fleeing Syria. And that the key difference is that many Venezuelan citizens feel that the government is unable to provide for them the adequate resources they needed to actually sustain basic life. CNN reported on January 17, 2018 that after looking back on the Venezuelan civil crisis, the majority of the casualties are actually been due to famine or inadequate health care being reached to its citizens, and that many Venezuelans are fleeing to many of its neighboring countries in order to reach a country where they can actually seek the basic goods necessary for life, such as food, water, and basic health care. This is a very key difference of being opposed to the Syrian civil war, because the Syrian civil war, that many people are now fleeing the nation because they were being assaulted by violence from the federal government rather than not being able to be provided goods from the Syrian government. The Christian Science Monitor reported on November 27, 2017 that after looking back on the course of the Syrian civil war, most of the casualties have actually been to direct military operations from Syrian leader Bashar al-Assad. And as a matter of fact, the Syrian refugee crisis actually kicked off back in 2011 when Bashar al-Assad gave the order to use illegal chemical weapons on his own citizens, killing thousands within the nation. This is a very key difference because now many Venezuelans flee the nation in order to find the basic goods that they need to survive, rather than the Syrians refugees that have to leave in order to escape the basic violence being subjected to them by their own leader and government. Besides the key differences in why the refugees are fleeing, there's also very key differences in the collaboration occurring between the neighboring countries, and that the Venezuelan neighboring countries such as Peru, Colombia, Nicaragua, and even Argentina are better able to get along in order to handle this Venezuelan civil crisis, rather than many of the Syrian's neighbors actually are unable to collaborate with each other on any action, rather than being unable to collaborate in order to fix the Syrian civil war. The Atlantic reported that on October 7, 2017, that a great coalition had actually been signed between the nations in Brazil, Argentina, Peru, and Nicaragua to give many of the migrants fleeing Venezuela to allow them to seek asylum within their own nations, and also agreed to send basic humanitarian aid to Venezuela in order to mitigate the disaster and actually collaborate more on them. This is a very key difference as opposed to Syria, where many of the Syrian nations are actually unable to work and get together. Such as the nations Israel and Iran have very key differences that prevent them from even being able to negotiate with any actions, rather than being involved in such a being involved in any of the Syrian civil war. Another key difference is not also that many of the neighboring countries are able to collaborate, but also there's not the scrutiny of many superpowers in the globe being involved in the Venezuelan civil crisis rather than the Syrian civil crisis. NPR reported that Secretary of State Rex Tillerson on October 2, 2017 stated that when handling the Venezuelan civil crisis, that the United States would only send basic humanitarian aid and would not actually conduct any boots-on-the-ground operations. A very clear difference, as in Syria, the United States and Russia are often involved with tactical airstrikes or in boots-on-the-ground operations that just go to escalate the violence. That is just not being shown as in the same situation as Venezuela as it is in Syria. Another key difference is that Venezuela is not sitting on such a key commodity in world markets that Syria is sitting on, particularly with oil. The Brookings Institute reported on September 18, 2017, that the reason the Venezuelan crisis is not with a mass scrutiny in the media as that the Syrian civil crisis is because many of the commodities that Venezuela offers to the markets are natural resources such as coal, natural gas, or agriculture, or cheap labor. And many other world markets can actually be obtained, can be accessed for these commodities, such as the upgrowing nations that are going in Africa, where they can access many of the agricultural elements, and also the cheap labor in many Chinese manufacturing, where many nations are actually able to move their factories to China to access that cheap labor in order to produce their goods much cheaper. And that since Venezuela is not sitting on such a rare and valuable commodity such as oil that Syria is sitting on, is that the whole world doesn't get as tensed up whenever any situation occurs in Venezuela as opposed to Syria. Now, in conclusion, analyzing the novel Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison, the nameless protagonist understands that the reason the population doesn't rally behind him in a civil rights protest as opposed to the protest of protecting the elderly couple that was evicted is due to key underlying reasons between the population and that situation. Although this novel was written in early 20th century America, a similar situation now occurring between world nations in the world, particularly with the Venezuelan refugee crisis. On February 15th, the World Health Organization reported that an astounding 1/5 of the medical personnel had actually fled Venezuela, leaving many Venezuelans unable to achieve this basic health care that they need. With Venezuela's citizens now left out of health care, it is imperative to ask the question, will the Venezuelan refugee crisis be as devastating as the Syrian refugee crisis? The answer to that question is no, because similar to Invisible Man, there are key underlying differences between the Venezuelan crisis and the Syrian refugee crisis that mitigate the disaster in Venezuela. The difference is in that why the refugees are leaving Venezuela is that many Venezuelans leave in order to seek basic goods in other nations, the fact that many nations are actually able to collaborate better in the Venezuelan civil crisis, and the fact that Venezuela is not sitting on such a valuable commodity such as oil allow it to be free from the scrutiny of the disaster.